All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I know that there are still folks arriving, but I'm just going to go ahead and kick things off because we've got a lot to talk about. My name's Liberty, and I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective. Today, we're excited to be hosting historian Garrett Felber in conversation with activists Lorenzo, Kom'boa, Ervin, and William C. Anderson. They'll be discussing Garrett's new biography of Martin Sostre, an underappreciated legend in the history of anti-prison and Black freedom movements. Check that out right there from AK Press. If this is your first Firestorm event, I'll just mention that we're a 17-year-old radical bookstore owned and operated by a queer feminist collective in Southern Appalachia on the land of the Cherokee people. We do a lot of events in person, and we've actually had the privilege of hosting Lorenzo and William in person previously. But we also continue to do conversations like this one online, both because we love to be able to connect with folks at a distance and because we know that it helps with accessibility for lots of folks here in our own community. Note that tonight we are using Zoom's Q&A tool. So if you want to ask any questions, and we would love to hear your question, you're going to find that probably at the bottom of your screen. There's also an open chat. You're welcome to post in the chat, but if you've got questions for the panel, it would be best to put those in the Q&A where we can keep track of them. Before we get too much further, I just want to, if you haven't grabbed a copy of this book yet, I just want to highlight what an incredible production it is. I actually don't know that I can't think of any other AK Press book that's ever been released in hardcover. I'm not sure if this is the first one. But it is a beautiful book and the information in it is incredible. So just to introduce our panel, I'm going to start right off with the author. Garrett Felber is an educator, writer, and organizer. They're the author of Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, The Black Freedom Movement, and the Carceral State, and co-author of The Portable Malcolm X Reader. Felber is a co-founder of the abolitionist collective Study and Struggle and is currently building a radical mobile library, the Free Society People's Library in Portland, Oregon. Thanks so much for being here today, Garrett. We also have Lorenzo Kom'boa Ervin, who's a writer, activist, and Black anarchist. He's a former member of SNCC and the Black Panther Party and Concerned Citizens for Justice, following an attempt to frame him on weapons charges and for threatening the life of a Ku Klux Klan leader. Ervin hijacked a plane to Cuba in February of 1969. And while in Cuba and later Czechoslovakia, Ervin grew disillusioned with the authoritarianism of state socialism. Captured by the CIA in Eastern Europe, he was extradited to the US, put on trial, and sentenced to life in prison in 1970. Introduced to anarchism while in prison, and that inspired him to write Anarchism and the Black Revolution in 1979. It was released 15 years later. Ervin remains politically active. It's a huge honor to have you with us here today, Lorenzo. And last but not least, we've got William C. Anderson, who's a writer and activist from Birmingham, Alabama. His work has appeared in The Guardian, MTV, British Journal Photography, Logix Magazine, and Prism, where he's a monthly columnist. William is the author of The Nation on No Map and co-authored As Black as Resistance. He's also the co-founder of Offshoot Journal and provides creative direction as a producer of the Black Autonomy podcast. His writings have been included in other anthologies, including Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect, and No Selves to Defend. Thanks so much for being with us here and playing a little bit of a facilitation role for us, William. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Garrett to just tell us a little bit about the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liberty. Thank you to Firestorm for hosting this event. I really appreciate you drawing attention to the hardcover, and I want to thank AK Press because I was a little pushy about really wanting a hardcover for a meaty biography like this, and they were willing to do that, and also to do a paperback incarcerated readers edition. So I encourage folks, if you have comrades or loved ones inside, you can send them a copy of that through AK's website as well. So huge shout out to AK Press for just being really amazing and flexible with that. Thank you, Lorenzo, William, for doing this conversation with me. I was thinking about how humbled working on this project was, and then just hearing Lorenzo's bio after my own. Nothing more humbling than that. It's like, so yeah, I appreciate you both being here and just being incredible comrades throughout the process of writing this book. This is how I came to know Lorenzo, was through the research for this book, and that's been a great honor. And William and I have really gotten to know each other through this as well. So Martin's brought me into touch with a lot of great folks, and y'all are at the top of that list, so I'm appreciative. Yeah, just to share a little bit about how I came to write a biography of Martin Sostre. I was working on my dissertation that became the first book about the Nation of Islam's organizing in prisons. And I came across a letter that was written from someone who was incarcerated with Martin. They were all being held in solitary confinement due to their religious beliefs and activism within the prison, and their lawsuits, more specifically for religious freedoms. And the letter was to Malcolm X, and I came across Martin X Sostre in there and looked him up and found out a little bit more about his frame up in 1967 in Buffalo. And the first place that I went really was to the Labadie Library at the University of Michigan, which, if folks don't know, it's an incredible collection of anarchist writings, mostly from the 20th century. And among the writings there were The New Prisoner, the pamphlet Martin Sostre in Court, Letters from Prison. And I was just fascinated by, what I saw as the arc of Martin's political development. And really at that point, I was just looking at the period from him being in the Nation of Islam in the late 50s, early 60s, to, the early 1970s as a political prisoner. And so I looked him up and found his address and wrote him a letter. And I was trying to interview him for the dissertation, and he basically said he was too busy. He was 90 years old at the time. And he sent me this incredible manila envelope of newspaper articles, a newsletter he wrote from solitary confinement, a picture of him at a preschool graduation, and essentially just said, these documents will tell you more than I could tell you about my life. So that to me is really what sort of sent me on this journey. It felt like a little bit of a historical assignment. And what I would come to find is really a much broader arc than that truncated one that I was interested in, of, how he helped bring around the first constitutional rights of incarcerated people as a member of the Nation of Islam, to his writing of The New Prisoner. And then really come to find out through folks like Lorenzo, the role that he played in, turning people on to anarchism and the foundations of Black anarchism. So that really sent me on this maybe 5-year journey of research, of interviewing folks, and trying to write this account of Martin Sostre's life and do it in a way that's accessible and interesting and has political lessons for us today, that isn't just simply, a play-by-play account of a interesting life. So yeah, with that, I'll kind of turn it over to William and just open it up for us to talk.
Yeah, thanks for that, Garrett. It is really a special and monumental occasion to have this text, and I thank you for offering it to the world. It's coming at a time where there's so much flourishing. There's so many groups that are coming up in terms of the development of this generation's different iterations of Black anarchists and anti-state and autonomous thinking there and organizing. There's so much in terms of the implications it has for this moment. So it's really amazing to think about it in that context of the timing of when it's arriving. And I think that, you know, I don't know if you planned it that way, but you really nailed it in terms of the relevance of it happening. So this is again, it's a monumental work. And before we really get into anything, I do want to say first and foremost, rest in peace to Sandy Shevek, who was a comrade and a friend of Martin. And he just passed recently, and I wanted to kind of uh, bring his energy into the space too, because I know that I was thinking about him when I was looking through the kind of things that we'd done on Martin in the past, and so on and so forth, as well as reading the book. But since this is such a monumental work, is finally giving proper recognition to someone who I consider one of the most underappreciated figures in the Black radical tradition. And I wanted to ask you, Garrett, what is the real reason you felt? I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit in your intro, but can you tell us like the real kind of like main reason, like deep in your core, like why you felt this book had to be written, why you couldn't resist writing it, and what you hope people will get from it, especially in this moment? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think Martin was one of those people who had such an outsized impact on uh, radical movements, and there was this generational amnesia or something that had happened where, like, if you talk to people who um, you know, were young radicals of the 60s and 70s, it was like when I asked them about Martin Sostre, it was like everyone knew. And then my generation and younger, it was like maybe people in a small, narrow set of circles knew his name, but couldn't really expound on those his ideas. So I think part of it was recognizing that, and I came to recognize this a lot more as I did the interviews for the book, but just how pivotal this moment was, that those stories were going to be lost forever if we didn't sort of get that generational knowledge in this moment. Exactly, from people like Sandy, you know? And then I guess the other part of it was that when Martin was being brought up, sometimes it was this really misrepresented or narrow reading of his politics as a kind of prison reformer, or, you know, as a jailhouse lawyer, but just narrowly through like legal victories and things like that. So as in like the 5 years after his passing in 2015, there were some kind of attempts to, like the New York Times, you know, obituary, to say like, wow, we really need to take a look at this person's life, but then to do so in a way that, you know, didn't actually, I don't even think that obituary mentions anarchism at all, right? So, so that was the other impetus, was just like feeling like this generational knowledge had to be preserved and transmitted, and then also making sure that Martin's ideas were represented in the fullest and truest sense.
Amazing, amazing. So with that in mind too, I think it kind of leads me into the next place I wanted to go in terms of, you know, Lorenzo, you're here with us, and you have really laid a lot of the groundwork for people in terms of, you know, that was my personal introduction to Martin, was through you. And I wanted to ask you, Lorenzo, kind of piggybacking off of what Garrett just spoke about in terms of this this neglect and the risk of losing such an important legacy. Can you talk about why Martin's story is so important? Can you talk about why his history is so important to you personally and more generally too? And can you maybe also speak to um, some of the reasons you feel like this legacy might have been neglected when it has been so oversized and has been so substantial? Can you talk about a few of those things for us?
Well, first of all, my meeting Martin Sostre, and before meeting him, I had no knowledge whatsoever of who he was. But I was on the run at that time in Germany. I'd hijacked a plane from the United States to Cuba, and from Cuba I then wound up into Eastern Europe, and I was captured in Eastern Europe and forcibly brought back to the United States. And at that time, in September of 1969, I was put in the federal, well, essentially the federal house of detention. I'm not sure if that's what they called it then, but that's what it was. And so I went into this federal house of detention, and I realized that I had a serious case when they brought me back to the United States. I'd had a court hearing, and they told me that I was on trial for my life. And that surprised me. I didn't know that, hijacking a plane was a capital crime, but it was. And so I decided that I was going to see somebody in that, if I could find somebody in the prison to talk about, helping me with my case. And so the circumstances I met Martin Sostre was, going to see a jailhouse lawyer, essentially a jailhouse lawyer, as they called them back in the day. And I talked to him, and we had a discussion about the case. It really surprised and unnerved him when I told him that I was facing the death penalty. Now, I was really young. I mean, I was only, 20 years old, 21. And I hadn't been to prison before. And so he knew I didn't know anything. I didn't have any way of defending myself. So every day we would start talking about how we were going to build a case. He'd get more information, he'd do research on the things that I told him and all of this. And so we started having this discussion first around legal issues. Now, I didn't know very much about his case that was going on at that time in New York State against the New York State prison officials. Now, the whole country or the whole, certainly the state of New York, was talking about this prisoner that had filed this lawsuit against the governor and the other prison officials and had them in court and, and was giving them business. And I didn't know anything about that, really. I mean, that was discussed later. The first thing we discussed was my predicament, and I explained how I was actually forcibly kidnapped from Germany and brought back to the United States. And that to hide this, the FBI put on a big show and arrested me in New York as if I'd come back to New York on my own, and they captured me. And because this was fiction. And so he said, I think that you can use the fact that these agents who were hooked up with the State Department, they were CIA, but they were hooked up officially with the State Department, Agency for International Development. And those people brought me back, and then they refused to testify. They wanted to disappear. He said, no, we're going to make those people testify how you were arrested, that the fact that you were illegally arrested, that the fact that you were tortured, and the fact that the American government is not going to give you a fair trial. You're going to be taken to Georgia, and you're going to be sentenced to death, and they're going to get rid of you. He said, that's what they plan on doing. And he said, so we're not going to allow you to pass away like that. We're going to force the issue. And so when I went to court, he had me go to court. He explained it, he briefed me and had me go to court. When I got to court, he had me make an outburst that I'd been tortured and that I'd been beaten and brought back to the United States illegally and so forth and so on. And the media always hang out in places like that, federal court. And it caused an uproar, and the judge didn't know what was going on. He had me come into chambers and so forth. And I was able to do exactly what Martin said, is to take the controversy of my arrest to get rid of the death penalty provisions, sentencing provisions of my case. And so that was how I first got to talking with Martin. Well, just so happened, I went back and I had several months there waiting to go to Georgia, and I was challenging their ability to have me on trial there. And so while I was there, every day I would go and have lunch with Martin Sostre, and we would talk about politics and struggle and different things. You know, he knew I was political, but I had no positive ideas about anarchism at all, none whatsoever. And I didn't have a great deal of information about revolutionary politics, even though I'd been an activist and so forth. You know, it's not like you go to school for this sort of thing. And I was from a small town in Georgia, in Tennessee, and you know. So we started having these conversations every day. And he talked to me about socialism. He talked to me about what he was calling anarchist socialism. And of course, in my mind, the only anarchists that I knew of were these groups like the ones attached to the anti-war movement, you know, these silly prankster groups, you know. I never considered them to be serious movements, you know. Jerry Rubin and these kind of people, you know, I thought they were a joke. And I didn't see where they had any relevance to black people or that black struggle anyway. He never told me that they did, but he said that anarchism itself is a universal revolutionary ideology, you know, and it's not just for white people or people of privilege, or it's not just for, you know, someone to be able to demonstrate knowledge, you know, espouse knowledge and not do any practical organizing. He says it's ideas for revolutionaries is what it is. And so he started every day, practically every day, that we could get together, explaining to me what all this stuff meant. And we would have literally school inside that, you know, prison. And nobody else came up. They were a lot of people were afraid of it. You know, he never smiled that much and so forth. So there's people afraid of him. And he had a fearsome reputation, you know. And so every day I would go there and pretty much be the only audience. And he drilled me. He told me about anarchism, told me about how to think critically, you know, how to think critically about ideas and about people. Instead of, you know, at this time you had so much, in the black movement in particular, this romanticism about black leadership and the black leaders. And so he said, this is not a good thing, actually. He said, the good thing is to have the people themselves with the power, not the leaders, you know. And so we had these kinds of discussions, and it raised my level of consciousness and made me have more of an understanding of not just anarchist politics, but revolutionary politics and revolutionary ideas generally. So there I was, you know, and as time went by, he began to tell me about his case and about the prison struggle and why he thought the prison struggle was so central. He said, like the civil rights movement, the prison struggle is based on an injustice. Prison itself is a crime. He used to always say that prison itself was a crime. And he said that what we need to understand is that we're not trying to just change prison. We're trying to destroy it. And the enemy society that uses prisons to oppress the people. He said, this is what we're trying to do. He said, and we're trying to use the enemy's own weapons, the legal system, education, and all of these things, use these things against the very society that created the injustice in the first place. So that was another thing, a key bit of understanding. he was one of the first ones to talk about what he was doing with the prison struggle, especially the fight against censorship. He was one of the ones who understood that it wasn't just the fight against censorship itself, it was the doors opening in the minds of people who would be able to read revolutionary literature. And this is exactly what happened. It wasn't just that people were able to get revolutionary books or able to just have these things in their possession. He had it so that the struggle reached the level where educational institutions set up by the state were actually superseded by or transformed by the struggle of the prisoners and turned into institutes of political education. For instance, let me give you an example. In Terre Haute, Indiana, we were able to take over the prison library system and create a lending library process. We being the black, it was a black radical movement that we had created legally with prison officials' acceptance of it. They didn't like it, but they had to accept it because the lawsuit that Sostre had filed had opened the door to so many things, so many applications of the First Amendment that we were able to push alternative programs. We had a book lending library that even went into solitary confinement and was giving books to Black prisoners primarily. And after a while, even something after the white population started to change from these Southerners and these Midwesterners to the prisoners that had been put in prison in opposition to the Vietnam War and all this. We started giving books to white prisoners as well. That was one of the most potent weapons that the prison movement had. And that all started with Martin Sostre, because he understood that in order to be all the revolutionaries, you have to create a revolutionary consciousness. And part of that is the possibility of belief. You have to defeat the enemy in the immediate sense so that you can then go to the next level of transforming the conditions of the place you're in. And, ultimately getting people out of prison. That started to happen as well. There's people who had no possibility of getting out of prison, and me being one of them. I had 2 life sentences without possibility of parole. Well, that's what I was given instead of them giving me life sentence. I mean, giving me the death sentence. They gave me 2 prison terms that would keep me in prison forever, theoretically, would have. So I kept fighting, and there are others inside the prisons like me, other political activists, other people who've been radicalized, and all of that. And those people started making impacts in their prisons like Martin was making. We were carrying out the program that Martin Sostre had given not just to me as an individual, but had given to others all over the country, And people saw also what he was doing, read about it in newspapers and so forth, and they started doing it, And so the struggle started advancing. And what else?
So yeah, you said something that I wanted to piggyback off of when you were mentioning Sostre's kind of moments of educating you and providing you with insights about how things have to be led by people. There was something I wanted to read from the book. I know Garrett probably doesn't want me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway.
You're an anarchist.
Exactly. I'm going to disrespect Garrett's authority, even though that this is technically his event. I do want to read a little excerpt from page 224 for those who have their copy and want to join in. The anarchist concept of prefigurative politics became central to Sostre's new political philosophy. The term is frequently attributed to social scientist Carl Boggs, who used it in 1977 to describe, quote, the embodiment within the ongoing political practice of a movement of those forms of social relations, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are the ultimate goal, end quote. Sostre was putting it into practice years earlier, describing it simply to one comrade, quote, if we do it right, it will end up right, end quote. Prefiguration represented an explicit rejection of the rigidity of Marxism and the hierarchical state centralism of Leninism and Trotskyism, although it implicitly rejected the vanguardist claim that the revolution would come, quote, from the outside, end quote, through the leadership of an advanced cadre, which Sostre had recently endorsed in, quote, the new prisoner, end quote. He was primarily concerned that revolutionary struggle not produce the fundamental flaws of the present order. And he wrote one supporter, quote, I believe that it is indispensable that we have such a network now, not only in readiness to supplant this dying repressive state, but to speed its demise. Otherwise, the repressive capitalist state will be replaced by an authoritarian state, and we will have to go through the same shit all over again, end quote. I wanted to read that and kind of bring it into conversation also with the point that you were making about the differences he was showing you in how you can approach struggle and how you can build revolution from below, Lorenzo, because I felt like that was such an important aspect of what you just shared. And you also touched on the next page there, Garrett, you had touched on this point about how Sostre saw his defense committee as a structure for the future, for him to be able to kind of build and illustrate through praxis the world that we should be living in. And I think that also one of the things you said, Lorenzo, when you were speaking, is you brought up this point about how Sostre said that the prison itself was a crime. And that stood out to me because it made me recall one of my favorite quotes that I say all the time to people, which is Sostre speaking about how the prison itself was a structure that's maximum security, but society as a whole was the minimum security prison that we were all in under this, repressive capitalist state. So taking all that into consideration, I really wanted to ask you now, Garrett, reflecting on where Lorenzo just took us and all of that I just read from the text, if you could speak about how Sostre was able to balance a vision for the future without propping up this sort of vanguardist rationale that he might have leaned on or entertained at some earlier points in his political trajectory. And Garrett, also, if you could tell us a little bit about how this story might, in your eyes, if I'm not projecting, be a part of a practice of those prefigurative politics too.
I mean, if you have thoughts on it, you should go.
Go ahead. That was directed at Garrett. That's my bad. I didn't specify.
The thing that I always picked up from Martin Sostre, we talked about socialism. Remember when I was arrested, I was leaving Eastern Europe, where these so-called existing socialist nations were located. And one of the things that he hit me in the face with was the idea of stateless socialism. And
Hold
we
up,
talked about
hold up 1 second. Hold that thought, Lorenzo. That question was actually directed at Garrett.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. I wanted Garrett to talk about that excerpt and then kind of touch on this aspect of the prefigurative politics. So if we can come back to you in 1 second, what I really wanted was, Garrett, if you could answer for me how this story might speak as a biography. How does Martin's biography itself maybe give us a example in terms of like the political education that we can draw from? How does it speak to the prefigurative politics? And I also wanted, Garrett, for you to address how he was able to kind of transcend this vanguardist rationale where he might have leaned on or entertained at earlier points in his life, how he was able to kind of transcend that. And then we'll come back to you, Lorenzo. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be confusing there, y'all. So Garrett, and then we'll come back to Lorenzo after you answer those couple of questions. I know I gave you 2 questions at once, but if you could answer those things, and then we'll go back.
Okay, cool. As long as we get to hear Lorenzo talk about that, because I want to hear that. So, well, one thing, there were like 7 things that came up when Lorenzo was talking. So I want to say, just to single out Lorenzo as really one of the lone voices during that period that I described as this kind of generational amnesia, where he was transmitting Martin's legacy to people like you through that oral tradition. So I want to single out Lorenzo for being really a lone voice who was doing that during that period. And just the significance of that tradition, as well as, you know, like in the research for this book, I came across how Martin was politicized inside by a Puerto Rican nationalist revolutionary lawyer, Julio Pinto Gandia, and then how he reproduced that mentorship of Lorenzo. So I just think there's that kind of generational component that I wanted to lift up. So to your question about the prefigurative, maybe just to give a little bit of background about the defense committees and that transformation for folks. So when Martin was arrested and framed in 1967 for running this revolutionary bookstore in Buffalo, he was supported by predominantly the Workers' World Party, right, which was a Marxist-Leninist group. And he had a centralized committee in Buffalo that supported him until he broke with them in 1970 over what he felt like was censorship of his ideas in a paper that he was editing and they were helping to produce. And so part of what he did as he started to identify more with anarchism was decentralize his committees. And he calls this his first experiment in anarchist organizing, really, is to create this federation of autonomous committees throughout, especially throughout upstate and North Country in New York, and see that not just committees to help bring him home, but actually revolutionary basis for future-oriented struggle. And I think in terms of his overall legacy, this kind of goes back to actually your very first question the part of it that I neglected to answer about what I hope people will take from Martin today, is at every single stage, he saw and demonstrated how dynamic struggle is and how multifaceted it is. You know, and he has that quote that I probably use twice in the book, but wish I could have used 10 times, about, you know, oppression being multifaceted. So the responses and resistance needs to be that way as well. But I just think he embodied that so well. Thank you, Huey. He embodied that so well in seeing a defense committee as something that was so dynamic, right? That it was something that would have a printing press and produce its own newsletter. It was something that would have committees within it and be expanding to think about, you know, what were the conditions at the local women's jail, and, you know, lead to all sorts of different local struggles while supporting his own. But people could be politicized through the sort of outrageous frame up that he had gone through, or what he was enduring in the courts and things like that. So that's one of the things that I hope people will get from his life, is just understanding how dynamic and multifaceted struggle can be, that it's not this sort of single issue thing. And then in terms of how I mean, I think because he was so against dogma and ideology and really saw ideas as things that were always constantly evolving through experimentation and organizing. That's what I love. That's what drew me to his life so much, is that you see the ways that he's constantly creatively organizing and then discarding ideas when they don't make sense anymore. So that vanguardist idea, and this idea of like revolutionary conditions that you wait for, and there's this sort of like perfect stew of revolutionary conditions, rather than the idea that you have a set of political practices that you're engaged in every day, and that's what creates revolutionary conditions. I mean, that's all coming out of his experiences and disillusionment with different organizations, like moving through the hierarchical structures of the Nation of Islam, of seeing the way that centralized organizations are failing. I mean, I think Lorenzo, you could probably speak to this, but you talked about what he turned you onto in thinking about the Panthers and hierarchy and centralized organizing. And certainly his experience with the WWP also led him to those conclusions. So I think all of that, and then just, you know, his belief that you actually had to show people tangible results to get that, to draw them into struggle. You can't just present them with utopian ideas, but you actually have to show them how in everyday practice those things are going to affect their material circumstances.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's a beautiful thing to celebrate Martin, but it's also simultaneously kind of sad to me at times when I think about the fact that we're still caught up in a lot of these cycles right now. And so much of the time when I'm, you know, reading Martin and, you know, going through this text and getting these different gems about things I didn't know about Martin, learning about these new aspects of his life, it's just very clear that he was way ahead of his time. And he was prophetic in many ways about the limitations of people who were kind of stuck in these orthodoxies. And he he's critical across the board. He doesn't hold back in terms of how he speaks about anybody. He equally distributes his criticism to many different uh, denominations of the left. So I think that what you said is so crucial about seeing that example and how it can help us to grow and hopefully go beyond all of this one day. And I wanted to now kind of go back to Lorenzo, but I kind of wanted to also direct maybe to see if you could speak to some things, Lorenzo, about you know, we've all done uh, work at this point, different things in terms of like thinking about how to compliment and how to appreciate Martin's legacy. And one of the things that came out of that was, you know, your idea, Lorenzo, of the Sostre Institute. And I kind of wanted to speak to you about this here as well, because, you know, we've been able to do a lot of different things in terms of like political education, but not just with the Institute, but in general. Lorenzo, can you kind of share what you see for the future? What do you want people to do with Martin's legacy, um, in terms of organizing, in terms of how to apply his thought and make it praxis, make it real? We speak so much about the history, and that's such a crucial part because people have to know who he was, obviously, and learn about his history. But can you also talk about what you would want people to do in the future, um, through things like the Sostre Institute and just through organizing principles that they could learn from Martin and the example that you learned that you got from Martin? Can you speak to that?
You know, I've laid aside so much the structuring of the institute, but I think we need to talk more about what Martin would have been if he was alive today. And the one thing we can say, he would have been an organizer, a revolutionary organizer. And so whatever institute we create, whatever role we want to remember him as, the first thing we want to remember him as is an organizer. He wanted to transform society. That was why he took on the prisons. One, he was in prison, but also the idea that he knew prisons were agencies for repression of the masses of people. He also knew that in order to destroy prison, you have to transform society. You can't just reform society. He understood he was not a reformer, not an actual reformer. He used the prison system, he used the law and the other things against the state as weapons, but he was not fooled that somehow the oppressors would turn around and genteelly eliminate those institutions of their own accord. The people had to destroy those institutions. So one of the things we have to make people understand, that everybody's called themselves abolitionists in this day, we have to make them understand that then we need to be working to abolish in the streets. The one thing he told me about organizing a mass anti-prison movement was that, one, we had to engage the people, not just the prisoners who were being victimized by the prison system, but the communities where they come from. And we had to talk about why prisons were being used in the first place, and why the resources of the prison, which were so harmful, were not being used to benefit the community as a whole. And so he's had to make these distinctions of revolutionaries as opposed to, at that time, liberals running the state. And so then he would talk to me about all sorts of things in relation to socialism, and the idea at that time was important that most people thought it was Marxism, Leninism, and all this sort of thing, and Maoism that only had the ideas for transformation of society and of people, And he talked to me about it. He said, well, yeah, but there's all kinds of socialism. Mm-hmm. He said, even anarchism is a derivative of the socialist movement. He said, it's stateless socialism. That it's a form of socialism that doesn't require rigid leaders and leadership. That doesn't require that society take on the role of having a dictatorship, because that's what most of the left in the 60s and so forth, and the period before, we're talking about dictatorship. And when you see the actual dictatorships in these states that they created, then you understood that fundamentally they were not a change for the better. So when I came to New York out of Germany, I was totally demoralized about social change and about the movement and about what I saw in the United States and all this stuff. It just didn't seem like there was any alternative, any positive development. So when I met him, I did a 180, and so he believed that a Black struggle can be a key struggle and could be a, what he called it, a pole of attraction. He said pole of attraction. He said everybody we're going to deal with won't just be Black. He said, but it can be a pole of attraction that can begin to transform the whole of society and can begin to bring new ideas that can radicalize youth especially, but even workers and other social classes. And so he always believed, he always had a belief system that revolution was possible. There are different forms of struggle, these movements have different ideas, but the authoritarian movements haven't demonstrated yet that any of these things free the people. They, in point of fact, have been oppressing their own people for long periods of time. You know, the 1917 revolution onward up to the time we were speaking, he said that, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of workers have been killed by the government itself, by these basically authoritarian regimes. And for me, this was one of the things I needed to hear. I needed to have this discussion to understand what the hell I had just seen. What was it that I had just seen in Europe, in Eastern Europe? What I had just seen in, you know, in Cuba and all these countries that profess to be revolutionary, that profess to be, you know, leftists and so forth, but yet they were just another form of authority, of unjust authority. And so we had that discussion, and he explained it to me, and he explained that why he was an anarchist, why he had chosen an anarchist perspective was because he didn't see within those structures any way for radical social change, actual radical social change. They were radical only in name only. They became bureaucracies that stripped the masses of people of any power in their own hands in favor of a bureaucracy. So I think that we need to realize that power, mass power, has to be in the hands of the people themselves, just as he had stated. Now, he wasn't the only one saying this. This was a minority opinion in the left at that time, but nevertheless, there were others he had convinced, and others, you know, he had come in contact with in books he'd read. So there were forces around the world that were starting to come to the conclusion that we needed to supersede Marxism and Leninism, not adopt it. It was a failure in point of fact. And it's taken years and years and years, so we've gotten to a point now that a viable anarchist movement can be built with a perspective that we have to organize in the grassroots level, but at the same time, we have to deal with the social structures and struggles that exist in this period. Prison is a reality, but you cannot destroy and defeat prison by itself. You have to defeat and destroy the system that uses prison as a tool of oppression. That's what I'm getting at. And he used to sum it up like that, you know, when I would talk to him, you know. I would be asking questions. And as a young person, I'd done some reading, and I had some formative ideas and so forth about this stuff, and you know, but what he could do was take complicated political theories and break it down so that you could absorb it. He could feed it to you. That's what he used to say. I can feed it to you, and you'll come away with a deeper understanding than if I spoke like a college professor.
Right.
But yeah, what I was going to say, the ideas, I'm not calling it all of it just stateless socialism, but it's just one of the methods that we have to adopt in order to build the kind of society and the fight the counter struggle and ideologically defeat not only the state but also the authoritarian left elements. That's always been the perspective I proceeded from. You know, not in a sectarian way. I'm not saying that all forces, even within the left, all forces are enemy forces, because there's some forces that can be won over, ideologically re-educated, whatever, you know. But it's not enough for us to just criticize and somebody was asking the other day about why make the criticism about the white left. Well, at the time, I was being confronted by and attacked by doctrinaire white anarchists and leftists. And so I had to fight it. But what we have to do at this stage is to take the ideas of Martin Sostre, to understand them, and then start building a broad-based, popular Black anarchist movement. I won't say just tendency, a movement. I think that's what he wanted me to understand. And my understanding of that much set me on the road eventually to create the ideas of Black autonomy and Black anarchist politics in this, in this period. And it's not perfect. He didn't get to tell me everything, and you can't expect someone to tell you everything. You have to look at. He gave me a process of understanding and of analyzing and breaking down and reconstructing ideas based around material conditions, actual material conditions that are happening. You can't have a struggle where your ideas are just based in an analytical sense only. You may as well just go to college and teach in college. You need ideas that can incite people, that can lay out a framework of struggle, that can lay out a fight back, and can popularize these ideas.
Right.
That's one of the problems that anarchists have. And even though they're popular in the sense that more young people are joining in and this, that, and the other, there are a hell of a lot of people being left out of anarchism and being left out of radical politics, period, because of doctrinaire politics.
Right.
I don't know if I answer your question at all. But anyway,
it was all relevant, and it did provide a lot of the feedback and the answer I was looking for, particularly in terms of how you were speaking about actually making it into a movement and actually making it into organizing that's sustainable and not just theoretical. So I think that you definitely hit the nail on the head. And I know that like we wanted to maybe take a couple of questions, and right before we do that, Garrett, if you could maybe just share, I might want to make sure we cover this, but Garrett, if you could maybe just share a little bit of the things that are happening on the ground in Buffalo. I know that there's people up there organizing themselves to try to clear Martin and Geraldine's record. Maybe if you could speak a little bit about that, as well as some of the other inspiring things people are doing in the spirit of Martin. And then we can maybe take a couple of questions and start wrapping up. That would be great.
Yeah, thanks for prompting that. So yeah, if folks want to check out the Justice for Geraldine and Martin campaign, you can access it either on Instagram or through the Martin Sostre Institute website. But one of the things that Geraldine Pointer, shared in the course of talking to her about, her frame up alongside Martin, and then really her marginalization in that history, was wanting to have her conviction overturned after all these years. She did over 2 years in prison, lost custody of her 5 kids. So there's a campaign to exonerate both her and Martin posthumously. And you can sign the petition online, but then, I think very much in the spirit of Martin's organizing, there's been an effort to reclaim the vacant lot at 1412 Jefferson Avenue, where the Afro-Asian bookstore was. So folks out there recently planted a community garden, built a radical library. There's a community bulletin board. So folks who are familiar with Martin's story of where he created the bulletin board outside of his bookstore in the aftermath of the rebellion, and cops would come by and tear down the posters and people would put them back up. So that's all really exciting and very much in the spirit of Martin's organizing and of not waiting for any particular person or authority to tell you you can do something, but just to reclaim space for the people in the community.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's been really inspiring to see the way people are organizing themselves and coming together in a way that is able to, I think, provide a lot of foundation for things for the future that can be built off of. It's just been amazing to see what's going on in Buffalo and other places around the country too, where people have been inspired by Martin's legacy.
Oh, I forgot too. Sorry, I should just shout out too. Tiana and James up in Buffalo are doing a freedom school for young folks. I believe it's ages 16 to 24 this summer. So again, like in the spirit of Martin's mentorship of young people throughout his long life. So yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Absolutely. Amazing. So there's a question I wanted to read here from the chat. I wanted to just try to cover a couple before we get ready to close out. But this question says, I was really fascinated by the Club Mela, which was described in chapter 2. I wonder if you, Garrett, can just talk a little bit about this club and the impact you think it might have had on Martin. Do we have spaces like this today? If you can mention a few, if we do, can you mention a few? And if we don't, when or how did we lose this idea? So can you maybe just tell us a little bit about that club and speak to that?
Yeah, so part of my own struggle and challenge in this book is that so much of Martin's early life was not documented or destroyed by the prison. So there's very little in his personal archive that predated his frame up in Buffalo when he was in his mid-40s. So the earlier chapters, I really just had kind of fragments of his life that he had mentioned, and one of them was Club Mea, which was named after the Cuban Revolutionary. And it was like a communist Spanish-speaking fraternal organization. So you could buy disability and health insurance through it. They had social nights, dances, political education. There was a section with books, and there was a women's auxiliary. And so Martin, we just had these kind of fragments of Martin remembering his father frequenting it. And I try in the book to do a little bit of troubling his childhood memory, which was like, oh, my dad wasn't political. He used to just go there and get the meals and play cards. But thinking about what it would mean to have like a robust social world that revolved around, communist ideas, and just what Harlem era or Depression era Harlem, would have looked like. Like it would have been this sort of thriving world of all sorts of community spaces with radical ideas. And obviously that's something that many generations have seen destroyed by all sorts of forms of state repression, gentrification. But that was very much, I think, that sort of space. And of course, what he saw with Louis Michaud's bookstore on 125th Street, or what he recreated throughout his life, whether in prison or through the bookstore in Buffalo or through the work that he did in New Jersey with the Juvenile Education and Awareness Project. It was creating, so-called third spaces or like commons, which, we have so few of today. And, in many ways, I've been inspired with the Radical Mobile Library that I'm building to think about the importance of space and creating, places where people can even encounter radical ideas, because those are so few and far between now.
Thank you. Perfect. And there's another question I wanted to kind of direct towards you, Lorenzo. If you could answer this, how can the legacy of Martin Sostre further the Black liberation autonomy movement in ways of organizing and thinking about the continued struggle?
We should use Martin Sostre as an example as to what can be done with his theories, and we can start to build a actual movement that deals with the critical conditions of the Black masses in the United States and in other parts of the world. Since Martin was he was a Black internationalist. And of course, his thinking always was that there would be, as far as he saw it, a massive tendency of Black anarchism in the United States and in other parts of the world. And if you consider the fact that in Latin America, there are more Black people there than there are, and there are more slaves in that part of the world than there was in the United States, we would stop the narrow thinking about the Black struggle just being an American struggle. That was one of the things he talked about. So we need an international Black anarchist inspired movement that also what used to be called, or is I could still call, grassroots organizing, based in the masses of poor and working people, as opposed to just the influence of the educated. So Martin never presented himself as being linked in any way to a college or university, because he understood that the masses of people come out of a different set of social circumstances. Certainly back then, came out of a different set of social circumstances. And I think that Martin's perspective on Black autonomy as an international movement, I would love to talk to some of our comrades. Every so often I get to talk with one from the Afro-Brazilian movement that are sympathetic to anarchism. But none of these groups there, anything, ever approaches them to be part of anything. So this is one of the things we need to think about, is how do we reach these different forces all over the world that already consider themselves or are sympathetic to Black anarchism. And once we do that, that one thing, as well as the thing about thinking beyond just ideas alone being a revolutionary thing. You know, ideas alone are not a revolutionary thing. They have to be coupled with organizing, you know, in the mass, in the streets. So that was what he was about. I mean, I can't say that what the conversation he had with somebody else was something else, but to me, it's always about revolutionary ideals, Black struggle, resistance. That's the road to revolution.
William, could I just hop in on that answer too? Because I think Lorenzo just brought up so many important points of Martin's legacy that maybe we didn't hit on earlier. So the internationalism piece, and then the action piece. You know, like I think his resistance of the state-sanctioned sexual assault of the strip search, right? The fact that Martin did that in a way that was narrated as an internationalist struggle. Like it was a struggle over his own individual bodily autonomy, but he described it as a one-person version of the National Liberation Front, right? So he always was narrating whatever struggle he was engaged in within the context of worldwide liberation struggles. And I think just lifting that part up, and then also the emphasis on action, that he believed that you could take action as a single person, and that was the most important thing that you could do in actually waging a counter war against the state. Because those, I mean, there's a way in which, from my vantage point, I wish Martin could see the ripple effects of what that resistance has done, because there are so many people who are still resisting this sexual assault in prison who can trace that lineage back to Martin. And I just think there's so many ways in which his life, taking principled action on his own, just had this ripple effect in which people were politicized by it, raised their consciousness, and to go back to that critique of the sort of bureaucratization of movements, like that's what he saw, is that people in street rebellions, right, there's this spontaneous sense of people's power that then got straitjacketed, or what he would say like de-anarchized, right, as people got that energy got captured and then funneled into a bureaucratic organization that had top-down leadership. So I just wanted to raise up those points that Lorenzo was bringing up about Martin's internationalism and his emphasis on action.
Yeah, yeah. It also made me think about Martin describing himself as Black Viet Cong, and how he took these opportunities, as you're pointing out, Garrett, to relate his individual struggle in a way that I think challenges a lot of people, because, so oftentimes within like left spaces, it's always like this extreme. It's either people are scared to touch the individual because they're like individualism, this boogeyman, and then it's like if it's not that, then it's people are focused on this like major homogenizing view of the masses, and that erases people as individuals within a movement in a way that can be disempowering. So it's like it's really interesting to look at Sostre in this regard, because I think that he strikes a really beautiful balance of being able to see himself as an individual and connect it to that greater good and larger struggle, as you're pointing out, Garrett. So yeah, that's really I think one of the most amazing things about him and his legacy. There's a question here I want to get, and maybe I'll do this one last, and then we can kind of start to close out. Are we about it? We're a little over time, right? So
No, we're doing great. Yeah, because we had 90 minutes, so we've got 15 more minutes.
Perfect. I wanted to make sure I was not messing
You're
it up.
doing, yeah, we're on track.
Okay, great. So yeah, I would love to get your question, Liberty, and then I want to read one more question from the chat. So Liberty, I think you had a question you want to pose.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think the thing that I maybe was interested to hear a little bit more about is the bookstores. As somebody who has spent much of my anarchist life doing bookstore projects, I think books and pamphlets play like this huge role in anarchist history. But it's kind of special to have an anarchist ancestor who to celebrate and like raise up, who also was like a bookseller or like a founder of like book spaces. So that's something that it really excites me. And you already spoke a little bit to the idea of the bookstore as a third space. But clearly, if it was just a desire for a third space, it could have been, Martin could have opened any number of different types of third spaces, or opened a bookstore and then opened a cafe. But having chosen to open a series of bookstores, I'd love to hear a little bit more about those spaces, what they were like, what we know about them, and also any thoughts that Garrett, you or Lorenzo might have about Martin's relationship to books as part of our struggle.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I was sort of frustrated when researching this book by how little we had of the bookstores in Buffalo. I mean, what's remarkable is that Martin created not one, not two, but 3 radical bookstores in Buffalo in the course of 2.5 years. I mean, I think that just speaks to like his imagination of what is possible at any time. So most of what I was able to gather about the bookstores is from the people who, were either college students or young teenagers in the neighborhood at that time. The memories that most folks had was just Martin himself described it as a community center. And so it was a space where people would, leave their kids while they went shopping, and Martin would, watch them, or you could come and read a book for a while and just put it back and then come back the next day. He talks about, experimentation with different things to draw young people in, right? So he starts with mostly novels, and then he brings in like statuettes and things. And then, he was selling Christmas cards. Like he was doing anything to kind of balance like paying the rent, bringing people in. And then he's got this breakthrough around playing music outside the store. And one of the things I really appreciated about learning from Geraldine Pointer was, Martin tells the story of putting up the loudspeaker and playing R&B records. And she was like, well, who do you think was choosing all of these records? I was in my early 20s. Martin was in his mid 40s. Like I was the one who was giving him all the lists off the radio of what to play. And so she ran the East West bookshop, which was predominantly records. And one of the things that she said was that was where a lot of the revenue was coming in to pay for the Afro-Asian bookshop, where Martin was selling Mao and Ho Chi Minh and Malcolm X. And I guess the other thing I'll say about just books and the role that they played in Martin's life is there's just such continuity. Like even when he's incarcerated in the Nation of Islam, they sort of construct these wooden libraries on the yard that are autonomously controlled. And then, fast forward 40 years, and I'm talking to the young folks that he mentored in the Juvenile Education and Awareness Project, and they described the library there in the vestibule of the community center. So there was just this really continuity, even in the types of books that he had. Like people would remember over a 30-year period, like the same Carter G. Woodson book. So yeah, I just think for him, political education, but creating spaces where it wasn't compulsory, it wasn't coercive, it was a space where people could come and find ideas and pick them up as they saw fit, was really important.
That's amazing too. And it's like one of those things that I feel comes up for me a lot personally in terms of like just the kind of current political environment that we're in, just in terms of the repression around literature, around diversity of thought and higher education, and just so much that we're seeing in terms of like this fascist crackdown. I think that Sostre's example really speaks to the importance of our ability to educate ourselves and to empower ourselves through reading in this way that's really inspiring, especially given a lot of the censorship and the attacks on Black history, especially. And when you really kind of think about that example and what Martin was doing, I think it also helps us to really counter and confront like a lot of the ways that like anti-intellectualism like creeps into left spaces, particularly the way that I feel like oftentimes there's a sort of really rigid and kind of small-minded way that we talk about education that centers academia at the expense of thinking about everything beyond it, and how we can empower ourselves and how we should be encouraging people to seek out higher education, not just through institutions, but through our own groups, our own study groups, through our own reading, through our own independent scholarly work. Yeah, I was just thinking about that just now, and I think that it kind of ties into this question I wanted to read here. I'm wondering about the biography form, its constraints in terms of individuation, and maybe some possibilities. Garrett, how do you approach telling the story of one man's life in light of the necessary collectivity of radical movements? That's a deep question.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a deep question that I asked myself a lot. Yeah, I love political biography. Like I think it's such an incredible organizing tool, because you get to see the transformations of one person as they meet like these different ideas and life stages and experiences. And then I also understand the trappings of the genre. So I tried to really, I think the thing that enabled me to the extent that I, could transcend any of those trappings was the interviews with people. Like, I think just being able to use Martin's life as a vehicle to tell the stories of other people, like Lorenzo enters the book at some point and all these other folks do in different ways. And I think that's a really, I hope, a compelling way for people to see themselves in those stories too, like ways that, maybe not everyone's going to engage in all the things that Martin did, but you can see the ways that other people struggled with him, around him, were politicized by him, shaped his ideas by sending materials inside that he could read. So I just think it's possible through that genre still to tell a very collective story. I mean, you can't actually tell Martin's story individually, right? Like he struggled collectively because that's the way that we all struggle. So I think, to tell the story in a way that's not collective would be dishonest. So the extent to which I did it remains to be seen, but that was certainly the intent.
And I think that perfectly leads into this next question. You mentioned the committees and organizing in the North Country in New York. I haven't dipped into the book yet, but do you go into further detail about that / are there other texts you'd recommend? I grew up in that area and I never knew about that radical history.
Yeah, I do go into quite a bit of depth in the later chapters around the defense committees in Plattsburgh and Potsdam. And that was, to me, one of the most fascinating revelations about this history. I didn't know much about it, but I interviewed folks or their children and got materials, especially a series of letters back and forth between Martin and an organizer in Potsdam. So to me, that was a really interesting history of like how, because Martin was incarcerated at Clinton prison, where they send you, it's known as Little Siberia, like they send you up there to be isolated. And he still created a federation of revolutionary bases around him from the prison. So I just think, yeah, his story is such an incredible one about like what's possible regardless of where you're struggling from. And I want to leave time for Lorenzo to chime into on anything that he wants to.
Well, the thing I like to chime in on is that Martin Sostre saw a book and radical writings as weapons, ideological weapons to combat the lies of the ruling class and to educate the uninformed, to build revolutionary ideas in people's minds. And through Martin Sostre, he was probably the principal figure that helped to create the anti-censorship campaign in the prisons that led to the creation of the prison liberation movement, or whatever you want to call it. At that time, there was different names for it: prison liberation struggle and so forth. But I don't think without Martin Sostre and his perspective on the importance of literature in combating the repression by the state of ideas, that we would have been able to have built that movement, that prison movement in that period of the late 1960s and 70s. That changed the lives and the fortunes of a hell of a lot of people, including myself, people who would have never had the perspective of getting out, who would have been living in prison under much worse conditions because prisoners had no rights that the government was bound to respect and all of that. So I think, Martin Sostre is a historic figure that at a particular period of time changed the world. And the Attica struggle and the whole things with George Jackson and all that. Much of that may have not even been possible without the struggle of Martin Sostre as a so-called jailhouse lawyer, a radical prison activist, and a Black revolutionary. He made a tremendous contribution that for a long time wasn't really understood. Some people did believe, even some prison activists thought that he was just a, jailhouse lawyer or reformer, and they didn't understand the entirety of the program to get revolutionary and radical literature in the hands of the prisoners, so they can transform their what was called a criminal mentality into a revolutionary mentality. That was really important part of his thinking, and that was when the last day I talked to him, one of the things we talked about is to carry on the struggle. If you go to prison, hopefully you beat the charges, but if you don't, you go to prison, you turn the prison into a program to better the condition of the prisoners themselves, but also to radically educate them so that they can fight back against the conditions of their oppression. And of course, build a Black anarchist or movement. But yeah, that was it for me. That was what I took away from talking to him. And I've thought about these conversations for years, ever afterward. His meeting was one of the most important things that happened in my life. And of course, you always think your life had meaning, but having met him, it had a hell of a lot more meaning than it would have otherwise.
Wow. I think that that's a beautiful place to conclude. Thanks for that, Lorenzo. It's leaving me with a lot to think about. I think for all of us, it's leaving us all with a lot to think about. This is an amazing contribution, Garrett. Thank you for this book. It's monumental. Again, I said it at the beginning, I want to say it at the end. It's a monumental text that's going to clarify a lot, and I think open a lot of people's minds to a lot of history, a lot of perspectives that they may have not entertained prior. So we thank you for bringing it into the world and for doing such a thorough job to bring Martin's life to light for a lot of folks. So is there anything you wanted to say, and then we can close it out?
No, just lots of gratitude to you both and Firestorm and all the folks listening.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, with that being said, thanks everybody. Thanks, Lorenzo. Thanks, Firestorm. Thanks, Garrett. And we can all have a good night.
It's been a great evening. Hope to see you all soon. Take care.
Bye, y'all.